Alexa, do you know anything about data?
Data is usually defined as a collection of facts from which conclusions may be drawn.
Alexa, can you help me understand how my data is collected online?
Sorry, I don't know that.
Alexa, how is my data collected online?
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Hello and welcome back to Frampton Unplugged, episode 8. Sorry I've been a little quiet over the last few weeks, but as you can probably just about detect, I'm still recovering from sinusitis and a bunch of other illnesses, so I figured I wouldn't look great on camera and you really wouldn't want to listen to me in that state. So today's episode is going to be all around online data, personal data, and going to ask the question of whether online data is friend or foe to the consumer. So the concept of data being used and collected to understand what people do and what they might buy is clearly not a new concept, but over the last 10 to 15 years, if not longer, with kind of the digital evolution, clearly the amount of data that's being produced is significantly more, and we've had some rather kind of high profile cases in the media recently, most notably Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, that have brought kind of full and frontal the kind of whole debate around the collection of what is essentially very personal, deeply human data and the use and harvesting of that data to generate profits. So today I'm going to talk about kind of this in a bit more detail. Some of you may have heard the term that I think The Economist first put on its kind of front page a couple of years back: data is the new oil. And there are lots of arguments that kind of around the definition of oil that you can relate back to that. The fact that data needs refining from a crude sense into something that can be valuable and used. But equally, there are also some slight issues with the metaphor, because data is infinite, whereas obviously oil is not. Oil is very expensive to find, it's increasingly disappearing, whereas actually in 2017 we had more data created than in the last 5,000 years of humanity. So in contrast to oil, data is something that's being created more and more every day and will continually be created more as we have more devices, more kind of wearable tech sitting around as new types of data are created. So where we are today is only the beginning of what will kind of exist in the ecosystem and in the atmosphere in terms of the amount of data that can be collected, can be used. So the discussion around how data should be used by companies and how ethical it is, I think, is one that has only just got started. So capturing and using data from a marketing perspective to drive kind of increased sale or conversion or cross-sell is nothing new. Probably the best known case study of creating a CRM system by collecting transactional data and mapping it with an understanding of individuals was Tesco Clubcard, run by dunnhumby, and we all know that case study. But in the last 10 to 15 years, a whole kind of new era of data-driven companies has arisen. We've become familiar with online services that are in essence free on the basis that the data is collected, and we all sign up to those terms and conditions, and we all don't read them, right? But consent is taken from a click and an agreement in a very kind of superficial way that the data that is collected about us, the data that we input, the data on where we surf, the data on how we interact with friends, the data that's collected via things like the microphone on our phone, and also the location and the kind of proximity that we may have to any particular place in time. All of those things are being collected by online companies. Software is often talked about as eating the world, but data is pretty much driving the profitability of most of the tech companies in the world. GAFA, Apple potentially doesn't need quite so much data to drive its profitability, given it sells kind of physical products. But Google, Amazon and Facebook, the predominant way that they make money is collecting data and using that data to inform the services that they create. Now, of course, we've all seen in the kind of press in recent weeks the whole case around Cambridge Analytica, and I'm sure that more will come out on this topic, how data is potentially kind of been used to understand human behaviour and then being used to kind of inform how content is kind of pushed around the ecosystem to change people's perception and ultimately potentially change their voting habits. So there's a big debate to be had around whether data is actually there as a friend to the consumer or whether it's a foe. Is it an enemy? Is it something that actually kind of endangers kind of individuals and kind of endangers how society going forward kind of will be formed and decisions will be made? So recently, before kind of filming this vlog, I put out a post on LinkedIn, which many of you responded to, so thank you, asking what you felt about kind of whether data, online data, is friend or foe. And just before I jump into the debate around that, let me just define what I mean by those two terms. So friend is in essence the fact that data can help improve your lives. It can help kind of make things better, quicker, faster. There are many services, whether it be Uber or whether it be Deliveroo, that obviously collect data in order to deliver a better consumer experience. We also obviously see that by data being collected and shared across the world, kind of new cures for diseases are being found, kind of new ways of understanding where earthquakes may hit and how to respond to them quicker are being found. And also kind of self-driving cars potentially will change the landscape in terms of the number of injuries as a result of collection of data. So there are many things that can be improved with data, and marketeers, at least at some of the big tech companies, would have you believe that the better the data they collect and use, the more they can provide relevant services and relevant advertising to you that is more personalised to your needs. The flip side is, however, that a lot of that data has been collected and organised, fused, leveraged, harvested in ways that consumers have no idea about. How many of us actually know how our data is being used and kind of collected by many of the big tech companies? The reality is that all of those systems are black boxes, and even some of the more kind of more recently launched services like the likes of Zoom and Slack are collecting data on their freemium services that is being used to better understand how people use their services so that they can then improve and develop those services. Now, there's nothing naturally kind of wrong or evil about that, but if you move over a kind of line into how data is being used to make decisions around kind of how content or how certain kind of services are put in front of a customer and the customer doesn't actually understand that, is that ethical? Is that a kind of fair way, a fair trade of the data that's been collected in return for a free service? A big discussion to be had. So that's what we're going to move on to next. So you're probably wondering, what was the overall kind of response from the LinkedIn post? Well, the vast majority of people, and bear in mind that a lot of my community is in marketing, potentially works in consumer insight, very close to data. The majority of that community were actually very concerned and more on the foe side than the friend side. And I'm just going to share a few of the comments that came out of the conversation. So many people talked about the fact that data harvesting exploits our fundamental freedoms, the freedoms that we have been used to in democracy. And actually the first step in getting that back under control is consent. That came from Nicholas Oliver, the founder of People.io, which is a business that is trying to give consumers, younger consumers, control of their data and the ability to actually be paid for their data or be rewarded for their data in the long term. Another person talked about rare moments of wonder are not worth the wholesale harvesting that happens with my data. So there's a big conversation here about the value exchange between what I give and what I get back, and the transparency around what is actually being kind of done with my data. Some people talked about the fact that they would feel more comfortable if they could earn kind of money or control in some sense through a dashboard the use of their data. I'm sure many others would not have the time or the will to actually want to do that, but the fact that it exists or could exist, I think is something that a lot of people would like to see. Another comment was that the benefits delivered are fairly marginal and that the abuse is often vast. So again, there is belief that the value that has been kind of traded back is kind of outweighed by the negatives here. The average person doesn't understand personalisation, nor do they actually benefit hugely from it from a marketing perspective. And another comment was that any benefit that a consumer may get, the kind of benefit that the company gets in terms of its understanding and kind of ability to drive profitability is 10 times kind of higher. So again, that kind of mismatch between kind of value from the consumer side. If we then turn to friend and to the more positive side, some people talked about the fact that data makes things more efficient, it makes the world better, but they did talk about the importance of legislation and ethics, and a lot of people talked about the fact that we wouldn't have platforms that connect us to kind of the world, whether that be Uber or Facebook or kind of even Google. We wouldn't have those services were we not trading in the value of our personal data. Again, often came to bear was the conversation around transparency and the fact that the value exchange was unbalanced. So even in the kind of friend or foe category, a lot of people are kind of still talking about the fact that were things done more ethically and more openly and more transparently, people would feel a lot more comfortable about it. But many of the corporates that are the biggest companies in the world are leveraging data to make money, but there's no transparency around how that happens. The previous biggest companies in the world, actually, whether they be oil companies or big kind of FMCG businesses, the reality is that they sold a very obvious product, and that product was a physical, tangible thing that had kind of hallmarks of quality and had to be kind of provided with certain legislation surrounding it. The reality is, because technology has grown so quickly and data collection has grown so fast, the reality is that governments and kind of intermediaries and bodies have not been able to keep up, and therefore the legislation that surrounds data is very nascent and very, very far behind the reality of what many of these companies are able to do. So again, a mismatch between what is possible versus what is fair to the consumer. So overall, I guess what you're beginning to see is that when you talk to people about it and when you actually engage people in the conversation around personal data, the vast majority of people want to know more about how it's being used. They've grown up in a world where if kind of they agree to do something and they give their consent, then they have a real clear understanding of what that consent actually means. And we could argue for hours around the fact that the consent given online, in the way that it's given and the user experience around it, is kind of intended to encourage you to run past it. I mean, everything we do on our phones through the news feed and kind of scrolling through moves at significant pace, and until Cambridge Analytica, I think we can pretty much say that anything that happened on Facebook or Instagram, the UX was not designed to get you to dwell and take time to read the terms and conditions, and it particularly wasn't written in a way that would actually help you understand them. In the last couple of weeks, many of you may have seen kind of what Facebook has now launched to kind of ask you to give their kind of consent as to how they're collecting data and how they're using it, whether it's your religious views, your sexual orientation, and how you want advertising to be personalised or not. The way that the UX has been designed around that is designed to help you understand it, to help you pause and take it on board. And it's interesting that that only happened as a result of something like Cambridge Analytica. So we can pretty much say that these companies have irresponsibly kind of collected data and used the fact that most consumers don't kind of pause to take consent kind of seriously enough. They've used and kind of to their advantage the fact that that data will drive their future profitability. So the other big kind of conversation surrounding the data space, which has been gathering momentum as we head towards kind of May time, has been GDPR. And a lot of people are hoping that GDPR will actually solve a lot of the challenges that we've been talking about. In the marketing space, many companies have been using questionable third-party data, collecting and harvesting data for their own purposes without any real kind of governance around it. I saw a statistic last week that suggested that up to 3/4 of all third-party data would be unusable post-GDPR. So many would hope that GDPR will clean up a lot of this, and I do believe that it gives kind of control back to many of the brands in the marketing space, but it does require that they become particularly kind of more kind of focused and kind of are upskilling their teams when it comes to first party data. First party data is data that has got much stronger consent around it as an individual, so therefore it's data that is higher quality, and often usually data where the consumer has actually given much more of a kind of signal that they are willing for that data to be used by that company, as opposed to third party data where a lot of that data is collected passively. So will GDPR improve things? I think it will, but I don't think it will kind of completely solve the issues that we've talked about thus far. The issues around kind of how data is collected and how the consumer is given control, visibility and transparency into how their data is used is a debate that I think will go on for many years. And we're beginning to see some interesting companies. I touched on one of them earlier, People.io, which is a business that I advise, another one called Liberty.io, which is an Israeli startup, who are creating kind of platforms that will give kind of consumers visibility around how that data is being collected, and should consumers want it, the possibility that they could decide how to monetize their data and almost kind of broker their data for return. The key things there, I suppose, are the kind of chronology around it. Before you can actually monetize it, you need to know how it's being used. You need to have some visibility, almost like an Experian kind of report that tells you how your credit scores are working. Nothing like that exists today when it comes to personal data. So what does the future look like? Well, for sure, one thing we can be certain of is the fact that there will be more data being produced and collected by companies with the Internet of Things, with more devices being connected to the web and more signals being sent back and forth. Imagine connected fridges, kind of imagine information kind of being pushed back and forward between Amazon, with Amazon Alexa starting to pick up the conversations we're having and responding to them. All of those kind of aspects of data, it will become increasingly important that the consumer is aware and understands how that data is being used in order to kind of push content or services back to them. So I think for me, my view on this is that data is a norm. It is the new normal. It will drive a lot of kind of improvements in kind of services that we kind of are given, and it allows us and allows people to be able to get more effective, faster, kind of cheaper kind of services in the future. However, companies that actually rely on data as their kind of bloodline, their kind of profitability, cannot continue to use data without there being more awareness around that. We can't have companies that have black boxes and have no legislation or regulation around them that allow us to understand how that is being used. And then it becomes down to the leadership within those companies as to whether they make decisions or whether they're doing the right thing or wrong thing. So ethics, transparency, visibility, all of those things are critical, and we need kind of a movement of education for consumers so that they are able to kind of act and kind of talk with their own voice about the need for this, rather than it just being a conversation understood by those in the marketing, technology or analytics industry. So for me, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Software and the collection and use of data to create a better world, whether it's kind of solving things like world hunger, or whether it's kind of finding new cures to diseases or preventing disasters. All of those things are truly building a better world. And I think all of us would agree that they are things that data can be used for, that we would all kind of support and back. However, when data is being used to personalise advertising, and that advertising is then kind of generating huge profits, there is a much more of a question mark, because the impact that that data can have on the consumer is arguably fairly minimal, but the impact that it has on the bottom line of that company is huge. So the question here is around kind of the balance and the value exchange that a consumer is getting back for their personal data. So I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I'd love it if you have a different view or you want to jump in on the conversation. I'll post the LinkedIn kind of commentary and the conversation below, but also jump in and kind of add your comments below as well, because this is a debate that I think will rage on for some time. So thanks for tuning in as always. I hope it wasn't too nasally for you and that you found the conversation interesting. If you haven't subscribed, then please do, so you can get an update on the latest videos, and they will become more often again. Now I'm getting back to kind of better health. Please do kind of give me a thumbs up if you liked the video, and of course use the comments field below because it really helps me to kind of improve the content if you tell me what you liked and what you didn't like. So I look forward to seeing you next time for episode 9. Alexa, I know you're listening. Could you please just turn everything off now?
Okie dokie.